The contents of these volumes have been written down directly from my dictation, over a period of several years, by my friend and wife, who wished me to tell her the story of my life. It was the desire of both of us that these details of my life should be accessible to our family and to our sincere and trusted friends. And we decided therefore, in order to provide against a possible destruction of the one manuscript, to have a small number of copies printed at our own expense. As the value of this autobiography consists in its unadorned veracity, which, under the circumstances, is its only justification, therefore my statements had to be accompanied by precise names and dates, hence there could be no question of their publication until some time after my death, should interest in them still survive in our descendants, and on that point I intend leaving directions in my will. If, on the other hand, we do not refuse certain intimate friends a sight of these papers now, it is that, relying on their genuine interest in the contents, we are confident that they will not pass on their knowledge to any who do not share their feelings in the matter. Richard Wagner, My Life, Part 1842. I was born at Leipzig on the 22nd of May 1813, in a room on the second floor of the Red and White Lion, and 2 days later was baptized at St. Thomas's Church, and christened Wilhelm Richard. My father, Friedrich Wagner, was at the time of my birth a clerk in the police service at Leipzig, and hoped to get the post of chief constable in that town, but he died in the October of that same year. His death was partly due to the great exertions imposed upon him by the stress of police work during the war troubles and the Battle of Leipzig, and partly to the fact that he fell a victim to the nervous fever which was raging at that time. As regards his father's position in life, I learnt later that he had held a small civil appointment as toll collector at the Randstadt Gate, but had distinguished himself from those in the same station by giving his 2 sons a superior education, my father, Friedrich, studying law, and the younger son, Adolf, theology. My uncle subsequently exercised no small influence on my development. We shall meet him again at a critical turning point in the story of my youth. My father, whom I had lost so early, was, as I discovered afterwards, a great lover of poetry and literature in general, and possessed in particular an almost passionate affection for the drama, which was at that time much in vogue among the educated classes. My mother told me, among other things, that he took her to Lauchestadt for the first performance of the Brut von Messina, and that on the promenade he pointed out Schiller and Goethe to her, and reproved her warmly for never having heard of these great men. He is said to have been not altogether free from a gallant interest in actresses. My mother used to complain jokingly that she often had to keep lunch waiting for him while he was paying court to a certain famous actress of the day, footnote, Madame Hartwig. When she scolded him, he vowed that he had been delayed by papers that had to be attended to, and as a proof of his assertion pointed to his fingers, which were supposed to be stained with ink, but on closer inspection were found to be quite clean. His great fondness for the theatre was further shown by his choice of the actor, Ludwig Geyer, as one of his intimate friends. Although his choice of this friend was no doubt mainly due to his love for the theatre, he at the same time introduced into his family the noblest of benefactors. For this modest artist, prompted by a warm interest in the lot of his friend's large family, so unexpectedly left destitute, devoted the remainder of his life to making strenuous efforts to maintain and educate the orphans. Even when the police official was spending his evenings at the theatre, the worthy actor generally filled his place in the family circle, and it seems had frequently to appease my mother, who, rightly or wrongly, complained of the frivolity of her husband. How deeply the homeless artist, hard-pressed by life and tossed to and fro, longed to feel himself at home in a sympathetic family circle, was proved by the fact that a year after his friend's death he married his widow, and from that time forward became a most loving father to the 7 children that had been left behind. In this onerous undertaking he was favored by an unexpected improvement in his position, for he obtained a remunerative, respectable, and permanent engagement, as a character actor at the newly established Court Theatre in Dresden. His talent for painting, which had already helped him to earn a livelihood when forced by extreme poverty to break off his university studies, again stood him in good stead in his position at Dresden. True, he complained even more than his critics that he had been kept from a regular and systematic study of this art, yet his extraordinary aptitude, for portrait painting in particular, secured him such important commissions that he unfortunately exhausted his strength prematurely by his twofold exertions as painter and actor. Once, when he was invited to Munich to fulfill a temporary engagement at the Court Theatre, he received, through the distinguished recommendation of the Saxon court, such pressing commissions from the Bavarian court for portraits of the royal family that he thought it wise to cancel his contract altogether. He also had a turn for poetry. Besides fragments often in very dainty verse, he wrote several comedies, one of which, Der Bethlehemitische Kindermord, in rhymed Alexandrines, was often performed. It was published and received the warmest praise from Goethe. This excellent man, under whose care our family moved to Dresden when I was 2 years old, and by whom my mother had another daughter, Cecilia, now also took my education in hand with the greatest care and affection. He wished to adopt me altogether, and accordingly, when I was sent to my first school, he gave me his own name, so that till the age of 14 I was known to my Dresden schoolfellows as Richard Geyer, and it was not until some years after my stepfather's death, and on my family's return to Leipzig, the home of my own kith and kin, that I resumed the name of Wagner. The earliest recollections of my childhood are associated with my stepfather, and passed from him to the theatre. I well remember that he would have liked to see me develop a talent for painting. And his studio, with the easel and the pictures upon it, did not fail to impress me. I remember in particular that I tried, with a childish love of imitation, to copy a portrait of King Frederick Augustus of Saxony. But when this simple daubing had to give place to a serious study of drawing, I could not stand it, possibly because I was discouraged by the pedantic technique of my teacher, a cousin of mine, who was rather a bore. At one time during my early boyhood I became so weak after some childish ailment that my mother told me later she used almost to wish me dead, for it seemed as though I should never get well. However, my subsequent good health apparently astonished my parents. I afterwards learned the noble part played by my excellent stepfather on this occasion also. He never gave way to despair, in spite of the cares and troubles of so large a family, but remained patient throughout, and never lost the hope of pulling me through safely. My imagination at this time was deeply impressed by my acquaintance with the theatre, with which I was brought into contact, not only as a childish spectator from the mysterious stage box, with its access to the stage, and by visits to the wardrobe with its fantastic costumes, wigs and other disguises, but also by taking a part in the performances myself. After I had been filled with fear by seeing my father play the villain's part in such tragedies as Die Wasse und der Morde, Die beiden Galerie-Sklaven, I occasionally took part in comedy. I remember that I appeared in Der Weinberg in der Elbe, a piece specially written to welcome the King of Saxony on his return from captivity, with music by the conductor, C. M. von Weber. In this I figured in a tableau vivant as an angel, sewn up in tights with wings on my back, in a graceful pose which I had laboriously practiced. I also remember on this occasion being given a big iced cake, which I was assured the king had intended for me personally. Lastly, I can recall taking a child's part in which I had a few words to speak in Kotzebue's mention has Andrew, footnote, misanthropy and remorse, which furnished me with an excuse at school for not having learnt my lessons. I said I had too much to do, as I had to learn by heart an important part in De Menschen außer der Reihe, footnote, the man out of the rank or row. In the German this is a simple phonetic corruption of Kotzebue's title, which might easily occur to a child who had only heard, and not read, that title, editor. On the other hand, To show how seriously my father regarded my education, when I was 6 years old he took me to a clergyman in the country at Possendorf, near Dresden, where I was to be given a sound and healthy training with other boys of my own class. In the evening, the vicar, whose name was Wetzel, used to tell us the story of Robinson Crusoe, and discuss it with us in a highly instructive manner. I was, moreover, much impressed by a biography of Mozart which was read aloud. And the newspaper accounts and monthly reports of the events of the Greek War of Independence stirred my imagination deeply. My love for Greece, which afterwards made me turn with enthusiasm to the mythology and history of ancient Hellas, was thus the natural outcome of the intense and painful interest I took in the events of this period. In after years the story of the struggle of the Greeks against the Persians always revived my impressions of this modern revolt of Greece against the Turks. One day, when I had been in this country home scarcely a year, a messenger came from town to ask the vicar to take me to my parents' house in Dresden, as my father was dying. We did the 3 hours journey on foot, and as I was very exhausted when I arrived, I scarcely understood why my mother was crying. The next day I was taken to my father's bedside. The extreme weakness with which he spoke to me, combined with all the precautions taken in the last desperate treatment of his complaint acute hydrothorax, made the whole scene appear like a dream to me, and I think I was too frightened and surprised to cry. In the next room my mother asked me to show her what I could play on the piano, wisely hoping to divert my father's thoughts by the sound. I played UEB, Immer True und Redlichkeit, and my father said to her, "Is it possible he has musical talent?" In the early hours of the next morning my mother came into the great night nursery, and, standing by the bedside of each of us in turn, told us, with sobs, that our father was dead, and gave us each a message with his blessing. To me she said, "He hoped to make something of you." In the afternoon my schoolmaster, Wetzel, came to take me back to the country. We walked the whole way to Possendorf, arriving at nightfall. On the way I asked him many questions about the stars, of which he gave me my first intelligent idea. A week later my stepfather's brother arrived from Eisleben for the funeral. He promised, as far as he was able, to support the family, which was now once more destitute, and undertook to provide for my future education. I took leave of my companions and of the kind-hearted clergyman, and it was for his funeral that I paid my next visit to Possendorf a few years later. I did not go to the place again till long afterwards, when I visited it on an excursion such as I often made, far into the country, at the time when I was conducting the orchestra in Dresden. I was much grieved not to find the old parsonage still there, but in its place a more pretentious modern structure, which so turned me against the locality, that thenceforward my excursions were always made in another direction. This time my uncle brought me back to Dresden in the carriage. I found my mother and sister in the deepest mourning, and remember being received for the first time with a tenderness not usual in our family, and I noticed that the same tenderness marked our leave-taking, when, a few days later, my uncle took me with him to Eisleben. This uncle, who was a younger brother of my stepfather, had settled there as a goldsmith, and Julius, one of my elder brothers, had already been apprenticed to him. Our old grandmother also lived with this bachelor son, and as it was evident that she could not live long, she was not informed of the death of her eldest son, which I, too, was bidden to keep to myself. The servant carefully removed the crape from my coat, telling me she would keep it until my grandmother died, which was likely to be soon. I was now often called upon to tell her about my father, and it was no great difficulty for me to keep the secret of his death, as I had scarcely realized it myself. She lived in a dark back room looking out upon a narrow courtyard, and took a great delight in watching the robins that fluttered freely about her, and for which she always kept fresh green boughs by the stove. When some of these robins were killed by the cat, I managed to catch others for her in the neighborhood, which pleased her very much, and, in return, she kept me tidy and clean.
Her death, as had been expected, took place before long, and the crape that had been put away was now openly worn in Ilban. The back room, with its robins and green branches, now knew me no more, but I soon made myself at home with the soap boiler's family, to whom the house belonged, and became popular with them on account of the stories I told them.
I was sent to a private school kept by a man called Weiss, who left an impression of gravity and dignity upon my mind.
Towards the end of the 50s, I was greatly moved at reading in a musical paper the account of a concert at Ilban, consisting of parts of Tannhauser, at which my former master, who had not forgotten his young pupil, had been present.
The little old town with Luther's house, and the numberless memorials it contained of his stay there, has often, in later days, come back to me in dreams. I have always wished to revisit it and verify the clearness of my recollections, but, strange to say, it has never been my fate to do so. We lived in the marketplace, where I was often entertained by strange sights, such, for instance, as performances by a troupe of acrobats, in which a man walked a rope stretched from tower to tower across the square, an achievement which long inspired me with a passion for such feats of daring. Indeed, I got so far as to walk a rope fairly easily myself with the help of a balancing pole. I had made the rope out of cords twisted together and stretched across the courtyard, and even now I still feel a desire to gratify my acrobatic instincts. The thing that attracted me most, however, was the brass band of a hussar regiment quartered at Eisleben. It often played a certain piece which had just come out, and which was making a great sensation. I mean the Huntsman's Chorus, out of the Freischütz, that had been recently performed at the opera in Berlin. My uncle and brother asked me eagerly about its composer, Weber, whom I must have seen at my parents' house in Dresden, when he was conductor of the orchestra there. About the same time the Jungfingkranz was zealously played and sung by some friends who lived near us. These two pieces cured me of my weakness for the Ypsilanti waltz, which till that time I had regarded as the most wonderful of compositions. I have recollections of frequent tussles with the town boys, who were constantly mocking at me for my square cap, and I remember, too, that I was very fond of rambles of adventure among the rocky banks of the Unstrut. My uncle's marriage late in life, and the starting of his new home, brought about a marked alteration in his relations to my family.
After a lapse of a year, I was taken by him to Leipzig, and handed over for some days to the Wagners, my own father's relatives, consisting of my uncle Adolf and his sister Friederike Wagner. This extraordinarily interesting man, whose influence afterwards became ever more stimulating to me, now for the first time brought himself and his singular environment into my life.
He and my aunt were very close friends of Jeanette Thome, a queer old maid who shared with them a large house in the marketplace, in which, if I am not mistaken, the electoral family of Saxony had, ever since the days of Augustus the Strong, hired and furnished the two principal stories for their own use whenever they were in Leipzig. So far as I know, Jeanette Thome really owned the second story, of which she inhabited only a modest apartment looking out on the courtyard. As, however, the king merely occupied the hired rooms for a few days in the year, Jeanette and her circle generally made use of his splendid apartments, and one of these staterooms was made into a bedroom for me.
The decorations and fittings of these rooms also dated from the days of Augustus the Strong. They were luxurious with heavy silk and rich rococo furniture, all of which were much soiled with age. As a matter of fact, I was delighted by these large strange rooms, looking out upon the bustling Leipzig marketplace, where I loved above all to watch the students in the crowd making their way along in their old-fashioned club attire, and filling up the whole width of the street.
There was only one portion of the decorations of the rooms that I thoroughly disliked, and this consisted of the various portraits, but particularly those of high-born dames in hooped petticoats, with youthful faces and powdered hair. These appeared to me exactly like ghosts, who, when I was alone in the room, seemed to come back to life, and filled me with the most abject fear. To sleep alone in this distant chamber, in that old-fashioned bed of state, beneath those unearthly pictures, was a constant terror to me. It is true I tried to hide my fear from my aunt when she lighted me to bed in the evening with her candle, but never a night passed in which I was not a prey to the most horrible ghostly visions, my dread of which would leave me in a bath of perspiration. The personality of the three chief occupants of this story was admirably adapted to materialize the ghostly impressions of the house into a reality that resembled some strange fairy tale. Jeanette Tomei was very small and stout. She wore a fair Titus wig, and seemed to hug to herself the consciousness of vanished beauty. My aunt, her faithful friend and guardian, who was also an old maid, was remarkable for the height and extreme leanness of her person. The oddity of her otherwise very pleasant face was increased by an exceedingly pointed chin. My uncle Adolphe had chosen as his permanent study a dark room in the courtyard. There it was that I saw him for the first time, surrounded by a great wilderness of books, and attired in an unpretentious indoor costume, the most striking feature of which was a tall, pointed felt cap, such as I had seen worn by the clown who belonged to the troupe of rope dancers at Eisleben. A great love of independence had driven him to this strange retreat. He had been originally destined for the church, but he soon gave that up, in order to devote himself entirely to philological studies. But as he had the greatest dislike of acting as a professor and teacher in a regular post, he soon tried to make a meager livelihood by literary work. He had certain social gifts, and especially a fine tenor voice, and appears in his youth to have been welcome as a man of letters among a fairly wide circle of friends at Leipzig. On a trip to Jena, during which he and a companion seemed to have found their way into various musical and oratorical associations, he paid a visit to Schiller. With this object in view, he had come armed with a request from the management of the Leipzig theatre, who wanted to secure the rights of Wallenstein, which was just finished. He told me later of the magic impression made upon him by Schiller, with his tall slight figure and irresistibly attractive blue eyes. His only complaint was that, owing to a well-meant trick played on him by his friend, he had been placed in a most trying position, for the latter had managed to send Schiller a small volume of Adolf Wagner's poems in advance.
The young poet was much embarrassed to hear Schiller address him in flattering terms on the subject of his poetry, but was convinced that the great man was merely encouraging him out of kindness.
Afterwards he devoted himself entirely to philological studios, one of his best-known publications in that department being his Parnaso Italiano, which he dedicated to Goethe in an Italian poem. True, I have heard experts say that the latter was written in unusually pompous Italian, but Goethe sent him a letter full of praise, as well as a silver cup from his own household plate. The impression that I, as a boy of 8, conceived of Adolf Wagner, amid the surroundings of his own home, was that he was a peculiarly puzzling character. I soon had to leave the influence of this environment and was brought back to my people at Dresden. Meanwhile my family, under the guidance of my bereaved mother, had been obliged to settle down as well as they could under the circumstances. My eldest brother Albert, who originally intended to study medicine, had, upon the advice of Weber, who had much admired his beautiful tenor voice, started his theatrical career in Breslau. My second sister Louisa soon followed his example, and became an actress. My eldest sister Rosalie had obtained an excellent engagement at the Dresden Court Theatre, and the younger members of the family all looked up to her, for she was now the main support of our poor sorrowing mother. My family still occupied the same comfortable home which my father had made for them. Some of the spare rooms were occasionally let to strangers, and Spohr was among those who at one time lodged with us. Thanks to her great energy, and to help received from various sources, among which the continued generosity of the court, out of respect to the memory of my late stepfather, must not be forgotten, my mother managed so well in making both ends meet, that even my education did not suffer. After it had been decided that my sister Clara, owing to her exceedingly beautiful voice, should also go on the stage, my mother took the greatest care to prevent me from developing any taste whatever for the theatre. She never ceased to reproach herself for having consented to the theatrical career of my eldest brother, and as my second brother showed no greater talents than those which were useful to him as a goldsmith, it was now her chief desire to see some progress made towards the fulfillment of the hopes and wishes of my stepfather, who hoped to make something of me. On the completion of my 8th year I was sent to the Crews Grammar School in Dresden, where it was hoped I would study. There I was placed at the bottom of the lowest class, and started my education under the most unassuming auspices.